welcome to another deep dive with us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Today we're going to be tackling Noam Chomsky's Year 501. The Conquest continues.
Oh, this is a good one.
I know, I'm excited about this one.
Right.
So this book, just to give a little bit of background, explores 500 years of history.
Yeah.
Really since Columbus.
Right.
And how colonialism and imperialism have kind of shaped the world that we live in today.
Yeah, and he pulls no punches.
No, he does not.
Yeah.
He especially takes aim at U.S. foreign policy.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're going to kind of break this down together and help you, the listener, make sense of some of his arguments and the history that he uses to back them up.
Sounds good.
So let's jump right in. Chomsky's main argument in this book is that the so-called discovery of the Americas wasn't really a discovery at all.
Yeah.
It was the beginning of a long and brutal campaign of conquest and exploitation that continues in various forms to this day.
I think that's one of the most fascinating things about this book, is that he uses all of these historical examples to really back up his points.
Yeah.
He starts by examining the early colonial period and these really larger-than-life figures like Sir Francis Drake.
Oh, yeah, I remember him from history class.
Yeah, he was this daring explorer, privateer, sailed around the world, right?
Yeah, all that.
But Chomsky brings up this point from John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who said that Drake's plundering was actually one of the cornerstones of British foreign investment.
So basically he's saying that the spoils from all that conquest fuel the engine of early global capitalism.
Yeah, pretty much.
It kind of makes you see these historical figures in a new light.
For sure.
Right. Like we tend to romanticize them, but Chomsky forces us to look at the often brutal reality behind the myths.
Yeah, and he doesn't stop there. He goes on to kind of dismantle this whole rosy narrative that we have around the East India Company.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what he says about that.
So we usually think of it as this, I don't know, mostly harmless trading company, right?
Right.
But Chomsky shows how it was actually like this military force that waged war, imposed monopolies, and just ruthlessly extracted wealth from India.
It makes you wonder where certain words come from, right? Like loot.
Exactly. It's no coincidence that the word loot entered the English language during this period.
It's starting to make this idea of conquest feel a lot less like hyperbole and more like a disturbingly accurate description.
Right. And Chomsky argues that these patterns that we see in early colonialism, they don't just disappear.
Yeah.
They persist, they evolve, and they show up in new forms.
So what does that look like today?
Well, he points to modern institutions like the World Bank and the IMF.
Okay, the IMF, I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of have a vague idea of what they do.
Yeah.
But I couldn't really explain it.
So the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund,
Yeah.
and it's supposed to stabilize global currencies and, lend money to countries that are having financial crises.
Okay.
And then the World Bank, their goal is to reduce poverty by funding all these different development projects.
So like building schools and infrastructure and that kind of thing.
Exactly.
It sounds pretty good on paper.
Yeah, but Chomsky argues that these institutions, especially the World Bank, they basically forced the Soviet Union and later China into playing these subordinate roles in the global economy.
So they're not as neutral as they might seem.
Well, that's his argument. And it's not just about controlling countries outright.
Yeah.
It's about setting up the rules of the game in a way that benefits the countries that are already powerful.
Can you give me an example of how that works?
Well, he's really critical of how this whole idea of the free market gets applied.
Yeah.
Like, he points out how hypocritical it is for Western powers to preach free trade to developing countries while completely ignoring their own history.
Okay, how so?
For example, in the 19th century, the U.S. was heavily reliant on high tariffs to protect their own industries. And they were also using all kinds of government intervention to boost their economy.
So not exactly a free market paradise.
Not quite.
It's like those parents who tell their kids not to eat junk food while they're stuffing their face with chips and soda.
Right. And Chomsky documents this double standard in painstaking detail.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that Western powers have historically used protectionist policies whenever it suited them,
Of course.
while simultaneously demanding open markets from everyone else.
I mean, that makes sense from a purely strategic point of view, but
Yeah.
it doesn't exactly scream fairness.
No. And he even brings up this infamous memo from a World Bank economist who suggested that dumping toxic waste in the third world actually made economic sense.
He actually said that.
Yeah, because, and I'm quoting here, life is cheaper there.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty chilling. And the economist's defense when he was called out on it was incredibly weak.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So Chomsky's not just engaging in some kind of abstract theoretical debate here.
Yeah.
He's forcing us to confront the very real consequences of these policies
Right.
and the often cynical calculations behind them.
So if the free market is often a rigged game, as he's suggesting, how does this idea of conquest play out in today's world?
Well, he talks about how the system is creating a two-tiered society.
A two-tiered society.
Yeah, he's basically saying that there's this widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, not just globally, but even within wealthy countries like the U.S.
So the gap between the rich and the poor is getting bigger, and he's blaming this system.
That's a key part of his argument.
Okay, I'm listening.
He says corporations are constantly pitting workers against each other in this global race to the bottom.
Yeah, trying to find the cheapest labor and the weakest regulations.
Exactly. And he uses that example of the chairman of Daimler-Benz who threatened to move production to Russia.
Oh yeah, I remember that. It was a big controversy.
Right, because workers in Russia were paid a lot less than workers in Germany.
Right.
And Chomsky uses that to illustrate his point about how this system works.
So he's criticizing the media too.
Yeah, he says that the media often focuses on worker strikes in wealthy countries and portrays them as greedy or unreasonable.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that narrative.
But they ignore the corporate greed that's driving these decisions in the first place.
So the media is playing a role in perpetuating this inequality. Not just reporting on it, but actually shaping how we perceive it.
Exactly.
It's all starting to connect back to this central idea of conquest,
Right.
this ongoing struggle between those with power and those without.
Absolutely. And Chomsky argues that even though the language has changed and the methods have evolved, the underlying power dynamics are still eerily similar to what we saw 500 years ago.
So it's not just a critique of the past, it's a warning about the present.
Yeah, he's basically calling us to recognize these patterns so that we can challenge them.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper into this.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that Chomsky does really well in this book
Yeah.
is he uses these historical case studies
Uh-huh.
to bring his arguments to life.
Okay.
And his analysis of the U.S. relationship with Latin America is
Okay.
a really good example.
That's a huge topic.
It is. He calls Latin America a testing area for U.S. policy,
Oh, interesting.
a place where you can see these dynamics of power and exploitation play out very clearly.
Okay. And he's very critical
Yeah.
of how the U.S. has consistently undermined genuine development and democracy in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying that the U.S. has been willing to prop up dictators and undermine democratically elected governments
Right.
whenever it suits their interests.
Exactly.
It's a pretty damning indictment.
It is. He goes into a lot of detail about how the U.S. actively blocked independent industrialization efforts in the region.
Okay, so, like, what's an example of that?
Well, he talks about Brazil and Venezuela
Okay.
and how the U.S. used economic pressure and even covert operations to ensure that those countries remain dependent
Okay.
on exporting raw materials.
Instead of developing their own industries.
Right. They didn't want them to become economic rivals.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think that the U.S. was essentially propping up dictators like Juan Vicente Gomez in Venezuela
Yeah.
just to secure access to oil and other resources.
Yeah, and at the same time, they were celebrating these so-called economic miracles, right? These economic miracles that were often built on the backs of oppressed workers
Exactly.
and rampant inequality.
Chomsky argues that these miracles were often just smoke and mirrors,
Okay.
designed to mask the brutal reality of exploitation.
So it's like this constant tension
Yeah.
between the rhetoric of freedom and democracy
All right.
and the reality of control and exploitation,
Exactly.
which is a recurring theme in Chomsky's work.
It is.
I mean, he seems to be constantly pointing out
Yeah.
the hypocrisy at the heart of U.S. foreign policy.
And he's not afraid to call it out.
And nowhere is that hypocrisy more evident than in his analysis of U.S. human rights policies.
Yeah, that's a big one.
He argues that the U.S. has this long and bloody history of supporting brutal regimes.
When it aligns with their strategic interests.
Right, it's not really about human rights at all, it's about power.
Exactly.
He talks about Indonesia and Chile as being particularly egregious examples.
Yeah.
The Indonesian massacre of 1965
Right.
is a really horrific event that's often just glossed over in Western accounts of the Cold War.
It's a really dark chapter.
And Chomsky presents evidence suggesting that the U.S. was not only aware of the massacre,
Uh-huh.
but actively supported it.
Yeah, it's pretty chilling stuff.
It is. And then he talks about the U.S. backing of the Pinochet regime in Chile,
Right.
which was obviously responsible for widespread human rights abuses.
Absolutely.
And his point is that the U.S. has consistently prioritized its own interests
Yeah.
over the well-being of people in these countries.
And they use this language of freedom and democracy
Right.
to justify their actions.
It's hard to reconcile these actions with the image of the U.S. as a beacon of human rights and democracy.
It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth
Yeah.
that our foreign policy has often been anything but benevolent.
He also takes aim at the IMF
Yeah.
and their role in Latin America.
Uh-huh.
He says that the IMF imposed austerity measures,
Okay.
which have had these devastating consequences for the poor.
Like what kind of consequence?
Increased poverty, unemployment, social unrest. Okay.
He talks about Honduras and El Salvador
Wow.
as examples.
Good.
And he contrasts the suffering of ordinary people
Yeah.
with the benefits that were reaped by elites and foreign investors.
So it's basically saying that these policies are not neutral.
Right.
They have real human consequences.
Absolutely. And those consequences are often borne by the most vulnerable.
Chomsky does a really good job of reminding us
Yeah.
that we need to look beyond the abstract language of economics
Uh-huh.
and recognize the human faces behind the statistics.
He wants us to ask
Yeah.
who benefits from these policies
Yeah.
and who pays the price.
That's a good question to keep in mind.
Yeah.
One of the other themes that really stood out to me
Oh, yeah.
was his discussion of historical memory.
Yeah, that's a really important one.
It's like he's saying that the U.S. has this tendency to kind of rewrite history in a way
Uh-huh.
that glorifies its own actions and downplays its own crimes.
Yeah, this kind of selective amnesia.
Right. It allows us to maintain this comfortable narrative
Yeah.
about our past.
Right, but it comes at the cost of honesty and accountability.
Exactly. He gives some really compelling examples of this.
Like what?
One of them is how the U.S. often focuses on the MIA issue in Vietnam,
Yeah.
while downplaying its own aggression and the horrific atrocities that it committed in Indochina.
It's like we're obsessed with finding every last missing American soldier
Right.
while conveniently forgetting about the millions of Vietnamese civilians
Yeah.
who were killed or displaced by the war.
It's a pretty stark contrast.
It is. He also highlights the fact that the U.S. censored information about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki
Oh, wow.
during the occupation of Japan.
Okay.
And he argues that this was a deliberate attempt to control the narrative and shield the U.S. from criticism.
It's like we're trying to bury the uncomfortable parts of our history.
Yeah, and Chomsky's point is that we can't have an honest conversation about the present
Right.
if we're not willing to acknowledge the darker chapters of our past.
It makes you wonder what other uncomfortable truths are being swept under the rug.
It does. He's calling for a critical and nuanced understanding of the past.
Yeah, one that recognizes both the triumphs and the transgressions.
Exactly.
So far, this deep dive has been a pretty intense journey
It has.
through history and power.
Yeah.
Chomsky's analysis is insightful,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also deeply unsettling.
It can be tough to face these realities.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like he's suggesting that these patterns of conquest and exploitation are
Yeah.
deeply ingrained in our social and economic systems.
He's not shying away from that.
So is there any hope?
Well, he doesn't offer any easy solutions.
Yeah.
But he doesn't think it's hopeless either.
Okay, so where do we go from here?
It can be a bit overwhelming, right?
Yeah, when you start to think about these systems of power.
It's easy to feel like, well, that's just the way the world works.
What can I do about it as one person?
Right. But Chomsky doesn't let us off that easy.
No, he doesn't.
He's forcing us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
Yeah. Precisely because he believes we have the power to change them.
Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, one of the key things he talks about
Yeah.
is understanding how these systems operate on this kind of subtle, everyday level.
Okay.
And he argues that the media plays a really critical role in all of this.
The media.
Yeah, because the media shapes public perception,
Mm-hmm.
and it often ends up reinforcing the status quo.
Even when it seems like it's being neutral.
Exactly.
He's pretty scathing in his critique of the media.
Oh, he doesn't hold back.
It's not just about bias or misinformation.
It's about how certain narratives are constantly being reinforced
Uh-huh.
while other perspectives are being systematically excluded.
Okay, can you give me an example of how that works?
Sure. Well, he talks about how unions are frequently portrayed in a negative light.
Oh, yeah.
They're depicted as corrupt, greedy, out of touch.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that.
And it's not just coming from explicitly conservative media outlets.
Right. This narrative often seeps into mainstream reporting as well.
It's almost like this constant drumbeat that undermines public support for unions.
Exactly. And on the flip side,
Yeah.
corporate wrongdoing is often downplayed,
Right.
or it's framed as the actions of a few bad apples,
Yeah.
rather than being seen as a systemic problem.
Which it often is.
Right. And Chomsky argues that this kind of media framing is part of a deliberate strategy
Okay, to do what?
to undermine worker solidarity and prevent any kind of organized challenge to corporate power.
So it's not just about physical force or intimidation, it's about controlling the narrative
Exactly.
and shaping public perception.
He sees a direct link between the decline of independent media and the rise of this corporate media dominance.
Right, because a handful of corporations now control most of the media that we consume.
Exactly.
And that's got to have an impact on the kind of information that we're getting.
It does. He argues that this concentration of media ownership has
Yeah.
led to a narrowing of perspectives and a reinforcement of the status quo.
It's harder than ever to find those alternative voices
It is.
and to challenge those dominant narratives.
And it can feel really disempowering.
It does.
But Chomsky doesn't think it's hopeless.
Okay, so what's the alternative?
Well, he points to the power of organized social movements.
Okay.
He talks about the peace movement, the third world solidarity movements,
Okay.
as examples of ordinary people coming together to demand change.
So he's saying that change is possible,
Yeah,
but it requires collective action
it does.
and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
We can't just wait around for things to get better on their own.
We have to make them better.
Exactly. And the first step,
Yeah.
according to Chomsky, is becoming aware of these systems of power.
Becoming aware.
Yeah, understanding how they operate and seeing through the propaganda that's used to justify them.
So education is key.
It's essential.
And then once we've done that,
Then we can start to imagine and build alternative systems.
systems that are based on principles of justice and equality.
Precisely.
Year 501, The Conquest Continues, is a really challenging read,
It is.
but I found it incredibly empowering.
Me too.
It really equips us with the knowledge and the critical thinking skills to understand these forces that shape our world.
And it doesn't just leave us feeling helpless.
No, it's a call to action.
It is.
It urges us to be informed and engaged.
Right.
And to never stop questioning those narratives.
To always be skeptical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Year 501. The Conquest Continues.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it insightful
And thought-provoking.
and ultimately empowering.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Into a new and exciting topic